some dumbass motherfucker John tried to get some for free. He was bigger than I was, so there was not so much I could do about it.
What, you mean he raped you?
Well, I guess you could say so.
No, Jack, he either raped you or he didn't rape you.
It was more, date rape.
Oh, great. Well, you probably enjoyed that then, didn't you?
Well, everyone has rape fantasy, don't they?
Jesus Christ, Jack.
I've been working with porn since I was a punk in the 80s. I started using found porn and doing collage and making Super 8 films with inserting pornography that we would find just that had already been made, like in a bin at a bookstore or something. So the use of pornography was very political because it was about showing it in a punk context. My friends and I were queer, but we were more in the punk movement. But in the hardcore punk movement in the late 80s, it was very homophobic. It was like the mosh pit and very aggro and macho. And so we started showing these queer-themed movies with pornographic content to kind of show to them that they might not be as radical as they thought they were if they can't deal with like full-on gay sexuality, so or lesbian sexuality. So that was how I started using porn, and then I started making my own porn very crudely, like very sort of naively, just making more like art porn films with my friends. And later in my career, I started actually making porn for porn companies. So it was a more kind of slightly more industry style porn, working with professional actors. But that was with a company that my producer of my early films formed, Katzo Film, the first porn company in Berlin. So it always had a kind of a more political angle to it, more kind of like radical queer angle to the porn that we made. You could say that all porn is political. I mean, you know, Godard said sex is political. I think you can say porn is political because by its very nature it challenges the assumptions of culture. You know, you're not supposed to make explicit work, like for example in movies, in the mainstream, on television, it's a taboo. So it's already transgressing certain boundaries. It has a meaning that's inherently kind of hostile to the rules of society. To, you know, people look down their noses at people that make pornography or appear in pornography. They kind of think they're above it, even though everyone watches it. You know, so it has a kind of already a kind of a subversive quality to it that goes against you know, conservative ideas and ideas of how you're supposed to behave in culture and in society. So it is political already, but I think that it's a great tool to be even more directly political, because everyone watches porn and it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, everyone understands the conventions of porn and uses it as a lot of people use it as part of their sex life. So I think it's an interesting genre to use to insert political content into even propaganda and to reach people, because they're watching it, they're in a receptive state, you know, and the most interesting porn to me is the porn that has narrative and that puts sex in some kind of context, a cultural context or a political context, and that makes it even more political.
I would give anything just to see a nice pair of tits again.
We shall overcome.
The radical left has become very politically correct. It's very dogmatic. It's certain elements of the radical left believe in censorship. They try to police language. They try to police desire, and this is a very dangerous thing. It's the enemy of art. You know, art is about total free expression, and for me personally, art has always been about challenging, challenging the propriety of culture and you know what is acceptable and what isn't. I try to represent the unrepresentable, you know, to figure out why are there these boundaries and how far can you push them. But my films have always been very critical of the radical left. I mean, it's easy to be critical of the right and conservatism because it's oppressive and it tries to impose its will on people. It doesn't allow women to have control over their own bodies. You know, it historically has tried to, you know, erase homosexuality, for example, so that's an easy target in a way. But the radical left also has its problems in terms of its strategies and the way it's kind of become politically correct and kind of censorious and judgmental, and the techniques it uses, like shaming and kind of like and kind of judging someone even before there's any kind of perhaps proof or process to kind of to analyze what is going on. You know, it's like a rush to judgment in a way. So there's a lot of problems on the left. In a way, I just keep making the same work always. I was a punk in the 80s, so I have a punk ethos. My kind of my kind of strategy is to always question authority, no matter if it's on the left or right. Like to subvert conventions, genres, you know, to look at things upside down and or you know, deconstruct them or kind of always be critical of conventional wisdom or of, you know, the way you're supposed to act or be an artist or be a person. So so now you know, we're in a regressive stage in the West very much. I mean, in America and Britain and Europe, and not only in a lot of developing countries, there's a lot of problems in terms of homophobia and violence against homosexuals and trans people, but in the West now there's quite a strong swing back to conservatism. So so in a way, it makes me feel like my work is like even more relevant now, you know, than it is sometimes when it's more. We're going through a little bit more of a stage of enlightenment. There's a lot there's a lot of material there to make work about. Yeah, I try to, you know, for one thing, I will move between making a super low budget film and then a you know, somewhat larger budgeted film. So the aesthetics can be very different. You know, I do guerrilla filmmaking, which is very down and dirty and kind of like rough, and then I'll do like a movie like Gerontophilia, which is a much bigger budget and very kind of looks like more like a mainstream movie. So I try to vary it up, but I kind of try to maintain the same sensibility and quite often I make movies for whatever reason about sexual fetishes of one kind or another, because you know, people with sexual fetishes interest me because they're usually looked down upon again by people, or considered perverts, or you know, outcasts, when actually the whole idea of a fetish for me is someone who has a real reverence for the love object, someone who has like who worships it, like almost like a religion. So my film started, you know, my career spans the whole era from pre-digital, from analog, to like very where we are now, which is like getting into advanced digital technology. So I made my very first films on Super 8 and edited and 16 millimeter and edited them on film, which was a very specific aesthetic, black and white. Now the Misandras, we shot on 4K, which is like a very high resolution, and it gave me a lot of freedom to make the film, even on a pretty low budget, a very low budget, to make it look like a kind of 70s mainstream film, or erotic film. So yeah, I like to play with. Sometimes in the transition from analog to digital, there's a lot of resistance for me aesthetically. So I would combine film and digital, and so the aesthetic would be very kind of fighting against each other, two aesthetics, which is an interesting aesthetic. I'm kind of really impressed by the level of queer cinema now compared to like 20 years ago or something. I mean, there was you know, what they called the new queer cinema of the 90s, which I was kind of like lumped in with. So, you know, you had Todd Haynes and Gus Van Sant and Rose Trosh and who else? Tom Kalin and Greg Araki, and you know, people like that. And then now there's a new kind of really strong group of filmmakers like Alain Girardi, who did Stranger by the Lake and Staying Vertical, and which was quite interesting. And I love Pedro Rodriguez, who did of course O Fantasma, which is a masterpiece, but is new in The Ornithologist is a brilliant film as well. And yeah, so I think there's quite a few new emerging filmmakers where they're making actually cinema that is still queer themed, but it really competes with like any other cinema, you know, which maybe wasn't happening so much like 15, 20 years ago.